floor is yours.
Thank you very much, you, Dan, for getting me here. This is my third time at the Birmingham Colloquium, but apparently enough for me to be a veteran. It's really cool. Right, so we start my presentation, which will be about Codex H, as part of the UK Research and Innovation Project annotating the New Testament, Codex H, Italian Traditions and the Humanities, which is based at the University of Glasgow. I assume that many of you will be at least somewhat familiar with the Euthalian Apparatus, but for those who are not, I will offer a very brief overview. Rather than going into extensive details, I'll concentrate on what elements of the Italian tradition are present in Codex H, and more importantly, how they relate to the core topic of this paper, which is the use of sense lines in the manuscript. So the Euthalian Apparatus is a set of editorial materials found in manuscripts of Acts, Pauline Epistles, and Catholic Epistles. It includes prologues, chapter lists, marginal notes, quotation markers, mainly from the Old Testament, and other features that organize and explain the biblical text. Though traditionally attributed to a figure named Vitellius, whose identity and date remain uncertain, the apparatus varies widely in form and content across manuscripts. Rather than a fixed system, the Italian apparatus is a flexible, modular tradition shaped by various scribes and contexts. In its most complete form, such as Lorenzo Zaccagni's 1698 edition, it consists of two groups of features. The first group includes core elements believed to stem from the original edition attributed to Euthalius, which is general and book-specific prologues, prefaces, list of readings, list of chapters, and lists of scriptural or literary quotations. And then there is a second group, which comprise more mobile feature, which has features that generally are later additions, so incorporated over time at different stages. And they are mainly short texts concerning Paul's life, travels, and letters. Codex H, also known as Codex Italianus of Gregorian O15, is the earliest known manuscripts containing Italian material, likely dating to the 6th to the 8th century. Long valued as a major witness to the Italian tradition in the Pauline Epistles, it is more than just a biblical text because it embodies a layered history of transmission, restoration, use, and reuse. By the 10th or 11th century, it was housed at the Megisti Lavra monastery of Mount Athos, where it was re-inked before 1218 as part of a restoration project in the Athos scriptorium. Later disassembled, its 46 surviving folios are now scattered across libraries in Paris, Turin, Mount Athos, Kiev, Moscow, and St. Petersburg. The ongoing project, Annotating the New Testament project, is working to recover missing fragments and produce the first full diplomatic edition with high-quality images. So far, 3 previously unknown fragments have been found, and much of the 41-folio material earlier on published by Henri Clement in 1889 has been restored. Codex H preserves not only the text of the Pauline Epistles, but also a complex layer of paratextual features added across different periods. Due to its fragmentary state, beginning only at 1 Corinthians 10:19, Codex H lacks the customary prologue to the Pauline letters, which typically precedes Romans. However, the preserved portion of the apparatus includes numbered Old Testament quotations with source attributions, numbered chapter lists of phalaia, and marginal numbers marking chapter beginnings, and finally, a sense line text layout with a colophon explaining this structure. Additional paratextual features include inscriptions to Galatians, 1 Timothy, Titus, subscriptions to Hebrew and Titus, stichometric notes, and liturgical annotations as well. And I'm just going to go through very quickly through these slides, just to show you that this is an example of a chapter list and numbers, which you can see in the left-hand margin of the folio here in question. This would be an example of quotation markers instead, so with various indication of the source from which the biblical text from Old Testament is taken, and you can kind of see on the left side there are some traces of reply, which probably are much better evidence in this fragment here. So on the left-hand side, you will find two reply and then the correspondent source of the biblical quotation. So just skipping over this, because this was really just to show what do we have in terms of Euthalian apparatus. However, my attention wants to be on the sense line text instead. One of the most immediate striking features of Codex H is its arrangement of the biblical text into short, often indented lines. This format, known as sense lines, structures the text into discrete units, cola and commata, typically consisting of meaningful phrases, clauses, or sentences, each beginning on a new line to enhance readability. This practice has its root in classical rhetoric, evident in Demosthenes and Cicero, and was adopted in early New Testament manuscripts from the 4th to 5th century onward, in particular in the bilingual manuscripts such as Codex Bezae, Claudianus, Claromontanus, and then later in Sangermanensis, Audientis, and Wernerianus. Jerome, in the preface to his commentary on Isaiah, acknowledges the legacy of sense line formatting, noting its presence in the poetic books of the Septuagint. More significantly, he claims to have applied a similar colometric structure in his Latin translation of the prophets to improve readability, making him the earliest Christian author to systematically adopt this method for biblical books, albeit in Latin rather than Greek. This division of prose into self-contained units mirrors poetic structure. In an era without standardized punctuation in Greek manuscripts, such formatting was essential for visually separating units of meaning, aiding both comprehension and oral delivery, whether in liturgical contexts like public readings or educational settings such as biblical instruction. In this way, the New Testament in late antiquity functioned as performative literature, meant to be heard as much as read. As Theodore Bert observed, all literature of antiquity was intended for declamation and recitation. It was perceived far less with the eyes, as it is today, and primarily with the ears. The relationship between stichometry, counting lines, and colometry, dividing prose into sense lines, has long been debated in manuscript studies. Early scholars like Charles Grove viewed stichometry as a purely mechanical method for measuring text length, independent of how the text was arranged, primarily because scribes were paid per stichos. However, others, such as James Randall Harris, argued that stichometry counts often aligned with colometric divisions, especially in literary and theological texts. James Randall Harris traced the term stichos from its origins in hexameter verse to its later use for sentence length prose units, showing how the two systems eventually began to overlap. Following this view, I treat here stichos as equivalent to a colon or comma and use stichometry to describe the structuring of sense lines in Codex H, a usage reflected in the colophon of Codex H itself, which refers to the layout with the term sticheron, as we will see next. In Codex H, the sense line structure is closely linked to its colophon on folio 96. Written in the first person, the rector describes the format as designed for ease of writing and reading. It also claims the codex, or its exemplar, was compared with a copy from Caesarea, attributed to Pamphilus, Eusebius' teacher, thus tying it to a major scholarly center, when it says the book was compared with a copy in the library of Caesarea written in the end of the Holy Pamphilus. The colophon has sparked debate, especially over its reference to Anevarius, whose name appears scraped off, overwritten, and possibly erased again before the text. The author of the colophon notes that the Pauline corpus was arranged stichedon, in lines, to promote clarity and understanding, where it says the text blah, 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 may be clearly written and easy to understand. This emphasis on legibility combined with a humble tone, according to my abilities, a request for forgiveness, for audacity, echoes language in the prologue to Acts, also traditionally linked to Eusebius. A passage from this prologue, segmented by Vermund Blomqvist as an editorial notice due to its discussion of features included by the prologue's author Aurelius, closely echoes the language of the colophon, especially when it says in the sentence stating, having organized the text into verses according to my own design, aiming at a clear reading. Even more significant is another statement from the prologue where the author boldly asserts this innovation. For there was never a man so stubborn and audacious that he himself would clearly molest the painstaking work of others with mediocre divisions of our unlearned reading. So despite his profession of humility, this emphatic declaration highlights not only the author's confidence in his editorial approach, but also his critique of earlier, less refined attempts at textual division. Influenced by this statement, scholars have long credited Euthalius with introducing colometric divisions in the Greek New Testament. Henry Aumont, in his 1889 edition of Codex H, even dubbed the format La méthode Euthalienne, seeing the manuscript as a key witness to this tradition. Yet, Euthalius never defines what writing stichedon entails and how it ensures eusemos anagnosis, a clear reading. What does this mean? Though it claims originality, the method remains vague, and it's unclear whether Codex H is the first to feature this layout or followed an existing model, as some scholars argue. In particular, Joseph Hermitage Robinson, in a 1895 long study on the Italian tradition, noted that many colla in Codex H span multiple lines, this being indicated by line spaces or indented lines, attributing the breaks to spatial constraints, namely the use of a large script, which is a biblical majuscule. He believed that the exemplar likely had one column per line, obviously larger margins. The sans line layout of Codex H has never been systematically studied. The only partial contribution in this regard was Albert Herard's 1891 study, which compared the colometric division in Codex Claromontanus and Codex H in select text passages, concluded that the two manuscripts follow distinct systems of textual organization and therefore have no direct relationship. Indeed, comparing Codex H sans unit layout with that of bilingual manuscripts like Codex Claromontanus or Bezae or Laudianus may be inherently flawed, as bilingual manuscripts serve a different purpose, aligning Greek and Latin columns for reference and ease of reference rather than adhering to the colometric principle of monolingual manuscripts like Codex H. Given this, it is essential to analyze Codex H colometry on its own terms. While some aspects of its colometric arrangement have been acknowledged, their full implications remain largely unexplored. This is also certainly because studying colometric layout of manuscripts may be a bewildering task. Dahl's study of manuscripts O230 humorously admits that the difficulty of such an undertaking is great, and he remarks that he might only have time to pursue it well after his retirement, if ever. Due to time constraints and the complexity of the topic, today's presentation offers only a preliminary look at the sans line layout in Codex H. Rather than a full study, I propose a stylistic and rhetorical reading of the material, an approach I plan to expand later on with further study. My initial findings indeed suggest that the lineation reflects more than practical concerns. It reveals an intent to emphasize rhetorical symmetry and parallelism. As Ronald Schutz describes, the search for parallelism in New Testament manuscripts reflects classical rhetorical principles. These principles emphasize the rhythmic quality of prose and the importance of eurythmia, a quality enhanced by phonetic devices such as alliteration and rhyme, which greatly contributed to a text's memorability. Edward Koenig, in his study of ancient and biblical prose, defines eurythmia as a balance achieved through variation and structured parallelism, such as alternating phrase lengths and mirror constructions. This rhythmic pattern is evident in New Testament texts where parallelism plays a key role. Linguist William Croft has shown that parallelism shapes intonation units in speech, guiding attention and aiding comprehension. Thus, it functions not just as a stylistic device, but a tool for enhancing how sacred texts are heard, remembered, and understood. In Codex H, parallelism appears at both the cola and commata levels, suggesting a purposeful effort to improve rhythm and readability. As the following examples show, this formatting shapes the layout of the following text and reflects a broader pattern across the manuscript. Now, if we look at folio free recto, first of all, this is a transfer ink folio, which is basically a page where the ink from a now lost ink facing folio has been imprinted onto its surface. And thanks to the multispectral imaging, the faded transferred text has been recovered and brought back to view. The repeated use of ete at the beginning of each line in line 6 to 8 introduces conditional clauses with a strong anaphoric effect, enhancing syntactic symmetry and reinforcing the passage's conditional structure. Although the scribe then placed the 8 of line 8 after pinetai in the previous line, it deliberately seems to start a new line with it to foreground the rhythm of the condition. Simultaneously, the position of verbs ending in etai, estietai, pinetai, poietai, at the end of each line creates an homoteleuton, reinforcing the actions through a rhythmic echo. A similar pattern appears on folio 16 recto, where ADs in lines 12 to 15 is placed at the beginning of each line, even though there was space to include this phrase at the end of each preceding line to produce an anaphoric effect. This deliberate choice highlights the sequence of conditional cola and builds a sense of progressive contrast between actions. The parallel structure enhances the rhetorical force of the passage, making the distinctions between each scenario more immediately graspable for the reader or the listener. On folio 16 verso, so on the verso of the symbol, we have an example that is particularly interesting because it demonstrates the scribe's effort to maintain the phonetic parallelism of the Pauline text. In some cases, this includes anaphora, and in others, epiphora. In lines 8 to 10, each ends with the phrase eisin kago. In line 9, however, we can notice that the final syllable go of kago extends into the margin, as placing it on the next line will disrupt the tricolon of short clauses that share the same ending. A similar effect can be seen in line 10, where the final vowel omega of kago also kind of protrudes towards the margin. And finally, on folio 17 verso, in a passage from 2 Corinthians 11:26 to 29, we see a series of short lines with significant repetition. The scribe emphasizes this in several ways. One is the anaphora of Quindunois at the beginning of lines 1 to 4 to highlight the theme of danger. The anaphora of N and the dative in lines 6 to 10, the article E plus noun in lines 12 to 13, and clauses starting with Ts in lines 15 to 16. To maintain the visual flow, the scribe forces the end of column 12 within the line, making the final syllable of emeran extend into the margin, and does the same with the syllable no in asteno of line 15. This is the last point I'm going to show, and then going straight to the conclusion. The structure of cola in Codex H often highlights parallelism through alliteration, enhancing both rhetorical and auditory effect. For instance, on folio 81 verso, which is 1 Timothy 6:11, the scribe closes the preceding section on vices with tauta fege, set off by a line space. This is followed by the imperative diokede, introducing the virtues in a chiastic 1 plus 2 plus 2 plus 1 accusative structure, each column marked by dominant consonant sounds. So the delta sound in diokede kaiosunen, the sigma sound in eusebeia pistin, the P and new sounds in agape and eupomonen, and the P sound in prau pateian. This segmentation reinforces the alliteration in the biblical text so as to enhance rhythm, memorability, and rhetorical force. Now, conclusions, though not exhaustive, these examples may be sufficient to suggest that the scribe of Codex H, albeit not always systematically, and this is important to remark, intentionally seems to have employed parallelism to enhance the rhetorical and aesthetic qualities of the Pauline text. Delineation creates both visual and structural symmetry, reinforcing meaning and supporting memorization. While practical factors such as space constraints and orthographic conventions certainly may have influenced the layout, the scribe's balance of cola and commata reflects a thoughtful and skilled approach. This in turn calls into question the colophon's modest claim of inexperience. Although such humility was common in scribal culture, the manuscript's deliberate and refined design points to a high level of craftsmanship. Whether the scribe was highly trained or working from a well-crafted exemplar, the visual shaping of meaning speaks to a practiced and discerned hand. While Codex H shares many traits with other early manuscripts, its distinctive use of rhetorical parallelism sets it apart, and I wonder if this is what the author of the Acts prologue has in mind when claiming originality for the work. Indeed, this layout not only makes the biblical text clearer and easier to follow, as the colophon suggests, but also enhances its aesthetic and performative appeal. Whether Codex H originated this layout or copied it from a lost exemplar remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that the scribe's careful attention to visualizing the parallelism of cola on the page reflects a deep sensitivity to the eurythmia of the biblical text, shared by the colophon's author and ultimately by the scripture author himself. And that's all. Thank you for listening.
So we have time for 1-2 questions. Yeah.
Thanks very much for this presentation. Thank you. Do you have any thoughts why this parliamentary didn't put this in the later transmissions of Euthalian?
Because we do not have many earlier manuscripts before the 8th, 9th century. So what we do have before the 8th, 9th century, so before the manuscripts, is only very little fragments of majuscules. So it's actually very difficult to determine whether they are incense lines or not. But most of what I've seen doesn't seem to have incense lines. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure why. Probably they do not descend from this manuscript. So the thing is that, and that's really curious, that the colophon that we have seen, it's only present in this manuscript and in one more manuscript that's of manuscule much later, which is supposed to derive from this one, but then we don't have it in all the other hundreds of manuscripts that have the Euthalian Apparatus. So it might just be because this manuscript, or maybe because of its history of being dismembered and then of being used to basically repurpose new manuscripts as a binding material, did actually gain the position to become the archetype of a new tradition. I don't know if that could be like a reasonable explanation. Yeah.
One last short question.
Very short question. Can I?
Yeah. No. I thought that Christina raised her hand, but yeah.
And what I think interesting about the project itself. So basically, I mean, and probably I skipped the beginning of the presentation, but is the project working just in the Pauline Apparatus, but also in other paratextual features that kind of in the manuscript, sometimes also alongside the
Yes,
text of the Pauline Apparatus?
Yes, it's a good question, and we are actually working on the all set of annotations that's present in this manuscript. So that also includes the very first ever edition of all the post-production annotations. And in fact, if you go right now on the NDVMR, there are new transcriptions from the project that will include also annotations, including as they could go like from a range of things such as alphabet, just by someone who was trying to learn Greek, and or there are annotations by someone who was trying to learn the accents and will say, okay, the great accents following this, or there is an annotation about the name of onoma, whether it's feminine or neutral, all this sort of stuff has been transcribed by our project, and so it will eventually come into this edition that we are planning to release hopefully very soon.
Unfortunately, we have to end the discussion here, but of course we can continue later. So let's thank again our speaker.